In our third installment on Chapter 15 on monetary policy, we're going to be discussing what are called policy constraints. So what's a policy constraint? Well, remember what a policy means is the government is attempting to do something, and let's say we're assuming we're going to be trying to stimulate the economy. So the policy would be, let's use monetary policy to stimulate the economy. And monetary policy was, let's change the amount of money supply in the system to influence interest rates, which will influence investors and homeowners to buy more stuff and thereby shift the aggregate demand to get the economy rolling again. So if the policy is only, the Federal Reserve only can control the money supply. They can't control the ultimate amount that people spend on new houses or new equipment. So it's a policy that we hope will work. In this set of slides, the 15.3, we're going to be talking about all the things that could make the policy less than it could have been. Things that would keep it from operating to full potential. That's what we mean by a constraint. So the first constraint we're going to be discussing is the short run versus long run interest rates. Now, with the first thing we discuss when we talk about the Federal Reserve affecting the money supply, we recognize it was affecting interest rates in the money market. Now, the money market is the market for very short run loans. It's called the money market for the reason that the investments in that money market are relatively short term. They're very, very liquid. They very quickly turn into cash. So they're money-like. So the money market is not literally the market to go buy literal cash. It's the market to buy securities that have very cash-like attributes. And those attributes being they're relatively safe. They convert into cash very quickly because they only, the loan only lasts for 30 days or whatever. So you could safely keep the money, locked up for 30 days, then it turns back into cash again. That's the money market. Now it turns out that aggregate demand is mostly stimulated by long-term purchases. Things like business people buying a new backhoe for a construction company or a homeowner buying a new house. But those decisions are usually affected by longer term interest rates, and especially the homeowners. That's the longest interest rate there is, 30 years. That's a very different market from the market for 30-day loans. So here's the interesting question. If the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, affecting the money market and therefore affecting the interest rates for 30-day loans, maybe even 60-day loans or 90-day loans, is it also going to affect the interest rates in the 30-year market? Or are those two markets kind of separate from each other? Well, the constraint says that they are separate to some degree. So, and there may be, and we'll talk about times when it turns out this way. But I think you can all recognize very quickly that stimulating the money market for 30-day loans may not stimulate the mortgage market, because the mortgage market may not respond to the increased money supply. It may all be absorbed in the 30-day loan market. So maybe the aggregate demand will not increase as much as we hoped that it would. So the Federal Reserve creates an extra $50 billion, which is a lot of money, extra $50 billion. If it all stays in the 30-day loan market and doesn't affect the mortgage market, it may not stimulate the economy very much. So that would be a constraint on the policy. Here's another constraint. Let's assume that we have what are called reluctant lenders. And that should be pretty much common sense what it means. Banks are reluctant to increase their lending activity. They don't want to make business loans. They don't want to make car loans. They don't want to make home loans because why? Well, because they're scared. If you're in the middle of a recession and people are defaulting on their car loans because they don't have jobs and can't make the payments on the car loan, how motivated as a banker are you to go out looking for new car loans? Most likely you're going to be pulling back, aren't you? You're probably going to be raising your credit standard. You're going to demand that people have a higher level of income for a particular car. You're going to demand, instead of zero down payment, now you're going to say, no, you got to put at least $1,000 down on this car. They're not going to be looking to make loans easier. They're going to be making loans harder to get. So here might be an interesting problem. Remember, the Federal Reserve can't order banks to make loans. We live in a mostly capitalist system where the government doesn't have the authority to order private citizens to do anything within reasonable limits. And this is one of them. Bankers cannot be forced to make loans. We are hoping to lure them into it by having the Federal Reserve lower interest rates, stimulating customers to say, you know, I think I'd like to go get that new car after all because the interest rates are low. But what if banks don't want to make loans? Well, that's the problem that we're discussing here. And in particular, let's look at a historical example. In 2008 to 2014, 2008 was the beginning of the quote-unquote Great Recession, which we've already mentioned once before. But the Great Recession was a pretty serious recession. Unemployment skyrocketed all the way to 10%. That's a pretty serious amount of unemployment, so the economy was doing badly. A lot of people defaulted on car loans. As a banker, what did banks do? They didn't want to make car loans. Oh, and other loans as well. So that's my point. The Federal Reserve was stimulating the economy, or so they thought. They were at least increasing the money supply to lower the interest rates to stimulate the economy. And interest rates did go incredibly low. And that was because the Federal Reserve was deliberately forcing those interest rates down by printing excess money supply. But what did banks do? Well, the banks basically sat on the extra money. They didn't try to lend it out. They mostly let it sit in their vaults as excess reserves. Now remember, we said normally banks want to get rid of their excess reserves by making loans, because that's the only way you make money is by lending it out and earning the interest. But if you're scared of your borrowers and afraid they're going to default on you, you definitely don't want to lend money to people who don't pay it back. There's no way to make money on those loans. So banks became scared and they cut way back on their lending activity. So as you can see, the rest of the bullets points, they're worried about the banks are worried about their own financial well-being because of the fear of their customers defaulting. They're worried about not being paid back by their weak borrowers. And also they're worried about new bank regulations. So all of these things, especially back in 2008 through 2014, caused banks not to follow the script, so to speak, that we normally expect them to do when the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates. So that would be another constraint. So the first constraint, excuse me, was the problem of short-run markets versus long-term markets. This one is the reluctant lender problem. And unfortunately, that's not the end of the constraints. Here's another problem. It's called a liquidity trap. Now, where does it get its name? Liquidity means the ability to turn an asset into spendable cash quickly. So cash itself is the most liquid. Things like overnight bank loans of Fed funds. That's the next most liquid, right? It'll be cash tomorrow morning. That's pretty darn close to being cash today, but not exactly cash today, but pretty darn close. So that's incredibly liquid. How about a 30-year mortgage? Ooh, not very liquid at all, right? You're tying your money up for a long period of time, and you can't get it back because the homeowner can't pay it back except through monthly payments, and is not legally required to pay it back except through monthly payments. And so therefore, that's a very illiquid investment. But of course, it earns good interest, so that's the trade-off. The point here, of course, is that with a liquidity trap, it could very well be that the money demand curve that we talked about at the very beginning of 15.1 may turn out to have a horizontal section to it. And what this means is that people are willing to hold an unlimited amount of money at some low interest rate, whereas normally they would have chosen to get rid of money by putting it into another investment. Let's take a look at a picture of it. It'll make more sense. Oh, I'm sorry, I went too quickly. The graph will be coming up in the next slide or two. Let's talk about low expectations. We'll again use the recession of 2008 to 2009, and then the aftermath of it all the way up to 2014. Now we're going to take a look at the business person's point of view, not the banker's point of view. Let's assume that you were a construction company. You're in the recession of 2008. House prices are falling. You can't even sell the houses you've already built. How motivated are you to go to a bank just because interest rates are low right now, to go out and borrow money to go buy raw land to build houses on when you can't even sell the houses you have right now? Well, you can see the problem, right? That's the low expectations thing. The low expectations means business people have low expectations of the future. And if you have low expectations of the future, then you have very little incentive to invest now, even if interest rates are reasonably low. And of course, consumers also feel the same way. If you're worried about getting laid off from work, how motivated are you to run out and buy a new car just because interest rates fell from 7% to 5%? Well, I mean, most of us don't want to both go through the destruction of our credit and losing our car. So you hold on to your old car for another year or two, hoping that next year maybe things will be better, and that will be a good year to go buy the car. So we can see that both business people can have low expectations of the future, and consumers can have low expectations of the future, and may not be motivated by the low interest rates that the Federal Reserve has artificially created by increasing the money supply. Now let's take a look at some pictures. Now I got the graph I told you about earlier. In the first graph, we're going to talk about we're going to be talking about a liquidity trap. Now you notice that for this part of the demand curve for money, it's downward sloping, meaning that if there was more money in the system, it would drive interest rates down. But take a look here. Once we get to this point here, E1, if we put more money in the system to E2, or even put this much money in the system, if the demand curve has gone horizontal, what does that mean? That means interest rates will not be driven down any further, because this means that, here we had, what, $1 billion of cash printed. Here we have $2 billion. Over here we have $5 billion. What are people doing with all this extra money? Well, they're not driving down interest rates. Instead, they're just leaving the money in the checking account. Liquidity trap means once interest rates reach a certain low level, you have very little reason to want to change your money from a checking account to an investment account, because at a super low interest rate, there's not really that much to be gained from having the investment account. So the point here is, once interest rates get to a certain low level, it can often mean that any further stimulus that the government tries to do through creating money supply will not drive interest rates down any further. The money will simply pile up in people's checking accounts and not do anything. That's the liquidity trap. In the next slide, we have something called an inelastic investment demand curve. Now, normally demand curves look like this one right here. They have a slope, which means that as the interest rate goes down in this direction, the quantity of investments goes up in that direction. That's what a normal demand curve does, right? The lower the price, the more the demand, the more the quantity demanded. We all recognize that. But take a look at this vertical section. This vertical section says, what if interest rates on heavy equipment fell from 7% to 6%? In this example, what would happen to the total amount of investments? Well, according to this curve, it stays exactly, you notice this black dot and this white dot, even though they're at different interest rates, they line up vertically with this dollar amount of investment. So investment wasn't stimulated, in other words. That's what a vertical inelastic portion of a demand curve means. It means that whatever's going on the y-axis does not affect what's going on the x-axis. You can see this number stayed exactly the same. Why would that be? Again, let's use the example of our construction company. You're in the middle of a recession. No one's buying the houses you're building right now. Interest rates are driven down by the Federal Reserve from 7% to 6%. How motivated do you feel to run out and buy a new backhoe when you can't even use the equipment you've got now because no one's buying houses? Well, I think you get the point. Investment may not be stimulated very much by the lower interest rates if we're in a severe recession. Another constraint, as we're going to see, there's going to be a lot of problems with trying to stimulate the economy through this monetary method. The issue here is time lags. So it takes time to develop and implement new investment ideas and desires in response to lower interest rates. Consumers also usually take time to decide to increase their borrowing. Through statistical investigations, economists have determined that it takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months before market behavior responds to monetary policy, which is a fancy way of saying if we lower interest rates from 7% to 6%, we don't get an instant bang to the economy to make it rise. It may take anywhere from 6 to 12 months before homeowners and business owners finally feel confident enough that the low interest rates get them to go into the bank and say, I'd like to borrow more money to do X, Y, or Z project. So time lags don't eliminate the stimulus. What they do is they slow it down enough that it may not be all that effective. Because it turns out that when you actually look at the historical record, the average recession only lasts about a year anyway. So if it takes that long for the stimulus to work, we'll already be coming out of the recession by the time the stimulus even works. So what was the point of doing the stimulus if it takes that long? Let me give you another analogy. Let's assume that some brilliant scientist comes up with a shot that that eliminates, or rather cures, a cold, but it takes 7 days for the medicine to take effect. Now, how fired up would you be about taking this medicine when the average cold only lasts between 3 and 5 days? If the medicine's going to take that long to work, you might as well just live with the cold, right? Why go spend money on the medicine if you're going to come out of the cold all on its own? Now, if the cold medicine would work within 6 hours instead of 6 days, then obviously it could be very valuable. As soon as you start feeling the cold starts to cause sneezing and feeling achy and whatnot, if you took the drug and within 6 hours you'd start to feel better, well, that might be worth something to you. But 6 days, you might as well just skip the whole thing. And that's the constraint we're discussing here. Maybe the monetary policy won't work fast enough to make it even worthwhile doing. So here's one last thing we're going to be talking about on, now we're going to be talking about monetary restraint. I was just paying attention to my own slide. Instead of stimulating the economy, now we're going to try to slow the economy. Now remember, the Federal Reserve could do that by what? Reducing the money supply, triggering an artificial shortage of cash that would cause interest rates to rise, and that would slow the economy. Now, what would cause that to not work? Well, first of all, what if instead of low expectations, we have very high expectations? In other words, contractors are selling every house they can build, and there's a line of homeowners willing to put money down on a new house, even though you haven't even broken ground and they haven't even seen the house. They're willing to put money down on a piece of dirt, and you'll start construction. Okay? Under those conditions, how badly do you want to buy new equipment? Oh, you really do, right? The construction company really wants new equipment to go do some more digging. So here's the question. If the Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 6% to 7%, would that get a business owner to say, I'm not going to buy new equipment this year? Probably not. The profits of building these houses is so great that if interest rates went up 1, 2, 3, 4, even 4% on construction equipment, you'd still have contractors buying the equipment. So that's what this means. High expectations could override the restraining effects of high interest rates. And then last but not least on this issue, money lending now is a global system. So if business people in the United States find that interest rates in the US have gone up and they're thinking about cutting back on the equipment purchases, they could instead borrow the money from Barclays Bank from England. Because obviously the Federal Reserve doesn't control their interest rates, and so it may very well be that especially large companies that have foreign subsidiaries, they could simply borrow the money overseas, and so therefore the Federal Reserve would have very little restraining effect on their desires. So we see that we made a long list of things that make monetary stimulus not work as good as we would like it to, and only a handful of things that would cause the monetary restraint to not work as good as we would like it to. So on this last point, on this last slide, we're going to take a look at the monetarist perspective. Monetarists are the folks who believe that the government should mostly use monetary policy in order to manipulate the economy. There's other groups of economists called Keynesians who have a different view on these things. So we're going to compare and contrast monetarists with Keynesians. So Keynesians say that the change in the money supply changes the interest rates, which shifts the aggregate demand. That's what we described in the last two lectures, the last two slide decks, 15.1 and 15.2. Monetarists say that the real output levels, in other words, the amount of cars being made, the amount of houses being made, are not affected strongly by monetary policy. That the price level is affected by monetary policy, but only by changes in the money supply. So the monetarists argue that monetary policy is not particularly effective for fighting recessions, but it could be a powerful tool for managing inflation. So depending on what it is that the economy is going through right now, monetarists may not be all that sanguine about whether monetary policy would actually work at fighting a recession. But fighting inflation, yes. They're they strongly believe that monetary policy can do that. And in a future set of lecture slides, we'll talk about where inflation comes from and why monetary policy appears to be better at fighting inflation than in fighting recessions.